Like to control everything. Welcome everyone, bienvenidos. I'm Alberto Díaz-Callero, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies. Welcome to the Friday Lectures Seminar Series, and thank you for those of you who are joining us through our YouTube live stream. Since the webinar is being live streamed, I do want to remind you that this is in the class YouTube page, and it will continue to be available for rewatching once the live stream ends. And lastly, please submit any questions you might have for Dr. Samuelson through the comments window, so the chat in the YouTube channel, so that I can then convey your question to her. Here at Stanford has actually put out an official land acknowledgement that it didn't have for a very long time. It was, in my view, about time. And I will read the new land acknowledgement, which has been sanctioned by the Native American community here. Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship with Native peoples. Thank you once again for joining us today for the talk Me gustaría que este libro no existiera, Negotiating Alternative Narratives of Violence in Contemporary Mexico by Professor Sheila Samuelson. It's a particular pleasure for me to be doing this in person. We have been working through the pandemic in a series of projects related to book presentations together with our colleagues at UC Davis and San Jose State University. And Sheila's students have been very active, also participants of these events that we're doing together. So it's really wonderful to have her here in person. She is a professor, as I mentioned, of Spanish and world languages and literatures at San Jose State University. She got her PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her recent publications include some article on Valeria Luiselli and some work on the Mexican writer Rosa Beltran. She's currently working on an edited volume, which is the subject of her talk, a book based on the narratives of Cristina Rivera Garza, an author we all deeply admire and who was a visiting professor here at Stanford, I guess 3 years ago. She's also a member of the UC Mexicanistas Research Association. So thank you, Sheila, for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Alberto. I definitely want to say it is amazing. I have not seen actual students in a year and a half, or some. This is my first time to sort of speak to a live audience, so it's really thrilling. Thank you, Alberto, and thank you, Elizabeth, who isn't here, for helping organize, and also Sara for helping set things up. I'm really excited to talk to you all today, and I hope that this will result in an interesting conversation afterwards. Thank you. Today I'm going to do a kind of a hybrid talk. So I'm going to talk about literature, I'm going to talk a little bit about concepts or theories, but I also want to talk about the sort of practical outcomes and how I have worked with different writers at San Jose State. And so there's going to be this kind of melding of ideas and what literature can do and what some of these books are doing, but then also what did we do at San Jose State with these writers, and that's one of the things that really interests me. So hopefully you guys will follow along and it'll make sense. How do we perceive and represent the complex geopolitical reality of Mexico today? What are the representations of Mexico that permeate popular cultural production in Mexico and abroad? Given the boom of depictions of narco-violence in the media and on popular television shows, the vision is often a simplistic and ultra-violent one, dominated by images of merciless and flamboyant narcos battling both each other and the government for control of strategic smuggling routes and sometimes entire regions of the besieged country. In one sense, it is natural that this would be the case, as violence related to the illegal drug trade and other criminal activities has dominated the national narrative in Mexico since at least 2006, when then-President Felipe Calderón declared war against the drug lords of Mexico. The numbers alone, some estimate over 250,000 dead and over 85,000 people missing, paint a grim picture of Mexico's current reality. We cannot turn our faces away from this terrible truth about a country we love. However, the ubiquitous rendering of the drug wars in popular culture and media in both Mexico and the U.S. foregrounds the spectacular nature of the violence, frequently glorifying and exploiting the images of the narcos who participate in the violence that has destabilized and reconfigured entire communities. The public's appetite for these representations of violent spectacle extends beyond Mexico's borders to engender a global perception of Mexico as a kind of failed state ruled by all-powerful drug lords and their expendable and interchangeable soldiers. The international successes of telenovelas and their literary cousin, the narco-novela, means that the public's attention remains firmly fixed on the spectacularized portrayals of a one-dimensional narco-narrative that emphasizes violence and the unfettered pursuit of capital at any cost. So, you guys have probably seen some of these. They're popular. I used to teach on mariachi, but I stopped for reasons that will become apparent. So these are some of the telenovelas or the narco-novelas. And then here we have some of these, very kind of stereotypical images of the narcos. So academic work that analyzes representations of violence also often concentrates on these ubiquitous hyper-violent, hyper-masculine, or hyper-sexualized narco-narratives. A brief search in the 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021 Latin American Studies Association meeting schedules amply demonstrates the hegemony of the narco-narrative in Mexican literary and cultural studies. Likewise, precursory searches for narco in the popular scholarly database JSTOR, as students you know it well, produces over 5,000 entries with over 2,000 for articles specifically mentioning Mexico. Scholars of Mexican literary culture have followed suit, studying the literary genre of the narco-novela in an attempt to understand both the cultural moment and the artistic expressions that draw on it. Critical efforts to understand the modern crisis through its representations have produced a body of criticism in both scholarly and popular press that takes the primacy of the genre as a given. And we have a small selection of the things that might be considered narco-novelas. This is not to say that they're all bad. There's some really great books in here. But it's a very kind of overwhelming genre, I would say, dealing with the situation. So the prevalence of violence as spectacle and commodity in contemporary literary and cultural production has been amply explored and critiqued by writers and scholars from Mexico and the U.S., including Diana Paulus-Versich, Sayak Valencia, Juan Villoro, Oswaldo Zavala, Ainhoa Vázquez Mejías, and Sophie Esch, among many others. Throughout these critiques, we see a common thread in the questioning of the ethical status of this kind of cultural production. Diana Paulus-Versich observes the effects of a publishing machine with an endless thirst for the violent spectacle of narco-violence, creating a narco-maquilla that has implications for the publishing industry and other aspects of the cultural economy, including book fairs, literary prizes, and educational mediums. Likewise, Zavala explains the pernicious impact of the ubiquitous cultural productions that turn the drug trade and its actors into commercially successful myths. That's a quote from Oswaldo Zavala. According to Zavala, this treatment of what passes for Mexican reality has created, quote, a literary field that has led, often uncritically, to scene after scene of brutality and senseless bloodshed in narco-narratives. Mexican writer and journalist Juan Villoro argues that the mythology of the narcos, as presented in narco-corridos, television programs, and novels dedicated to depicting their larger-than-life wealth and cruelty, serves not only the criminals it glorifies, but also the government and police forces simultaneously ineffectual in the war against the narcos, and all too often complicit in the illegal trafficking of drugs and the prevalence of corruption and impunity in Mexico. There is no doubt that this critical corpus represents an important contribution to the field of contemporary literary and cultural studies in Mexico. However, for many scholars and people who care about Mexico, the overwhelming focus on narcos and what has come to be known as narco-cultura presents an additional ethical challenge for our discipline. While it's obvious this kind of analysis is necessary to understand the contemporary landscape of cultural production in Mexico, the way narco studies has tended to dominate critical conversations about contemporary realities in Mexico has obscured other modes of cultural and critical production that address that violence, and especially its victims, with less spectacle and more empathy and more ethical engagement. For this reason, The work that I am lately most interested in centers on contesting this overwhelming emphasis on narco-novelas and other expressions of narco-cultura by placing on center stage narratives that explore alternative, artistic, ethical, activist, theoretical, and communitarian responses to unspeakable violences across a broad and interdisciplinary range of cultural productions. These alternative approaches include explorations of the representations of the victims and survivors of violence in Mexico, the portrayal of psychological and societal effects of destabilizing violence across social strata and in diverse cultural productions, including narrative fiction, critical essays, poetry, film, music, philosophy, and journalism, and considerations of various kinds of violence. In concurrence with a growing vein of self-aware criticism and thought, we should aim to broaden the analysis of the cultural landscape of Mexico's reaction to less spectacular forms of violence, such as symbolic, systemic, and economic violences, to offer diversity of perspectives that develop a much-needed counter-narrative to spectacularized narratives of violence. So before I dive into talking about specific authors today, I'm going to digress a minute to underscore that this is not an abstract question for those of us here in the U.S. educational system. The materials related to contemporary Mexican realities that we choose to share with our students and the ways we encourage them to engage with these materials has a real impact on how Mexico is understood and felt by these students, many of whom have close personal ties to Mexico. This is especially true at my home institution. San Jose State is a Hispanic-serving institution, but in the Spanish section of my Department of World Languages and Literatures, far from the mere 25% required to reach that designation, the vast majority of Spanish majors, minors, and MA students fit under the admittedly disputed rubric of Hispanic, with the majority claiming ties to Mexico. I was hired specifically because of my research interest in contemporary Mexico and the relevance of this interest to our students. My first semester at SJSU was fall 2014. On September 26, 2014, 43 students from Ayotzinapa Rural Teachers College were kidnapped, murdered, and disappeared by what we now understand to have been a collaboration between local police and organized crime. The reaction of our students in the Círculo Hispánico at SJSU was instantaneous. They organized a march and created a video in solidarity, in solidarity with the missing students. They asked me to join them, and I did. This event made it clear to me who my students were and how I needed to serve them. For many, Mexico was not a foreign country. It was home, or it was home to people they loved. For this reason, I have dedicated much of my time at San Jose State to organizing events with authors from Mexico who connect with my students. Over the course of the last 7 years, I have expanded my ambitions for these events, from simple author talks to writing workshops and public and community events, including students and authors, and based on carefully planned semester-long curriculum integration across all our Spanish programs. The authors that I'm talking about today have all visited San Jose State, and so my understanding of their work and engagement with it has been in the context of bringing them together with my students and offering them the opportunity to talk with these authors and engage with their work in meaningful ways. So my plan today is to talk about Cristina Rivera Garza, Sara Uribe, and Balam Rodrigo as representatives of alternative modes of narrating the violence in contemporary Mexico, while also speaking about how we engage with these writers and their work at San Jose State. The work of these writers serves not only to address the question of how to represent the violence in Mexico ethically, but it also serves to counter some of the most pernicious and racist myths propagated in the U.S. about those who have immigrated here from Mexico and Central America, myths that are actively harmful to our students and the well-being of our communities. Cristina Rivera Garza. Me gustaría que este libro no existiera. I will start by talking about how Cristina Rivera Garza's recent work provides a critical framework with which to understand the current literary production in Mexico that engages with the question of violence, as well as a proposal for the ethical representation of the tragedy of today's Mexico. Cristina has spent significant time here at Stanford, so I offer this reminder of some of her most important ideas with the understanding that a lot of you have read her work and will be interested in talking about how her ideas play out in the cultural landscape of contemporary Mexico and its literature. Cristina Rivera Garza, for those of you who don't know, probably all of you know, is one of the most renowned writers in contemporary Mexico, and the recent translation and publication in English of a number of her works is bringing her texts and ideas to the attention of readers and critics in the U.S. Indeed, along with her work promoting creative writing programs in Spanish, these works and translations have brought her to the attention of the MacArthur Foundation, which named her a MacArthur Fellow for 2020. After years of living and working in this country, Rivera Garza has officially arrived in the United States, receiving positive reviews in both the New York Times and the Washington Post for her essays on the violence in Mexico and the resources we may have to confront and depict it. When she says, "Me gustaría que este libro no existiera," Rivera Garza frames her work, specifically the book Dolerse, Textos desde un país herido, under the conditional and the imperfect subjunctive, a way of underscoring her writing as it is arising from a reality she would prefer not to exist, but that she feels compelled to confront. This is the opposite of the gleeful exploitation that we see in many narco-narratives, in that the writer here reluctantly but resolutely takes up the weighty questions of how or whether writers can write about the violence in Mexico. In her text, Muertos indóciles, Desapropiación y necroescritura, Rivera Garza interrogates the very act of writing and digs down into its ethical and empathetic implications, echoing Theodore Adorno's well-worn query about writing after the Holocaust. She asks, ¿qué significa escribir hoy en ese contexto? ¿Qué tipo de retos enfrenta el ejercicio de la escritura en medio donde la precariedad del trabajo y la muerte horizontal constituye la materia de todos los días? ¿Cuáles son los diálogos estéticos y éticos a los que nos avienta el hecho de escribir literalmente rodeados de muertos? In these essays on the topic of violence and its representation, she draws on a voracious crosscut of theoretical text from diverse and well-known critical traditions, weaving the ideas of thinkers like Judith Butler, Achille Mbembe, Adriana Caballero, Rita Segato, Jean-Luc Nancy, Helen Sissou, and Deleuze and Guattari together to form her own critical understanding of the catastrophe and what is to be done. In her effort to think through the seemingly intractable problems facing her country, she finds illumination in the writings of indigenous Mije philosopher Floriberto Diez, who describes a communitarian mode of living that inspires in her a hopeful vision of how to write and how to live together in a structure of mutual aid that moves beyond the logic or illogic of late capitalism and the neoliberal economies of the race to the bottom. For Rivera Garza, the urgency to understand and confront Mexico's struggle is personal. In her home state of Tamaulipas, she mourns the inclusion of her childhood home in the tragic list of Las Necrópolis Contemporáneas, in which personal and community safety is non-existent. And in the English publication of Grieving in 2020, she addresses, for the first time publicly, the tragic death of her own sister, Liliana Rivera Garcia, in 1990. A victim of feminicide whose killer remains free, Rivera Garza's sister's story demonstrates just how close she is to the heartbreak suffered by families in Mexico, who have not only lost their loved ones to violence, but also must find a way to endure the outrage and despair of knowing that the crime remains unpunished. The publication of the story of her sister in El Invencible Verano de Liliana in 2021 marks the culmination of Rivera Garza's search for a language and a community adequate to tell her story of loss, a loss shared by countless others, but until recently born in silence. Drawing on the ideas of communality and the interdependence of both beings and texts, Rivera Garza proposes a particular kind of writing, a writing she calls disappropriation, or desapropiación, which involves the active recognition of source materials and relationships in the text. In conversation with her, she has described it as showing the seams, and it is designed to avoid the pitfalls of appropriation and the egoism applied by the idea of the unitary author. In her mind, writing implies a debt, always unpayable, but also always necessarily acknowledged. She explains, quote, "A disappropriative text flaunts the marks of other people's presence and work, the labor of production and distribution carried out by entire communities. Language is not a raw material or an instrument, much less a natural resource, but a fraught relationship involving bodies, intense volatile contact with other bodies as they partake of the creation and recreation of our material worlds. There are layers of collective work behind each and every word we employ. There is history, strife, tragedy, loss, blood, and hope. End quote. We see this strategy throughout Cristina Rivera Garza's own writing in the melding of discourses and sources in the text, and in the open citation of her sources at the end of her narrative text. It is a testament to her skill as a writer that, far from distracting from the affective impact of her work, this open way of showing how she is in material communication with other writers and other texts has become part of what moves us and part of what keeps us alert to the subtleties of the questions she asks in her work. In the context of writing about violence, these disappropriative strategies are deployed by Rivera Garza in the creation of what she calls necro writings. Forgot to advance. There we are. Through disruptive processes, these writings act to counter the acceptance of violence as part of business as usual, as she explains, quote, necro writings are born into a world of horrific carnage and governed by states that have traded their ethics of accountability to their people for a logic of extreme profit. They incorporate grammatical and syntactical practices, as well as narrative strategies and technological exercises that question the state of things and the state of the language available to us. Political, in the broadest sense of the word, violent and violated by the assaults of a twilight world, these inappropriate necro writings go hand in hand with death, stepping on death's heels, pressing on death's solar plexus, wherever they may work. Necro writings are the direct counter to narco-narratives. They are the texts that refuse to be numbed by death and refuse to be silenced by fear. That's me, not her. For Rivera Garza, necro writings are accomplished in the context of communality and shared grieving. Through the strategy of disappropriation, the acknowledgement of interdependence and death, we see texts that evoke and invite a shared experience of mourning that leads not to the paralysis of horror, but rather to the reassertion of life through shared grief. Dolerse, that is finally a condolerse, a, quote, condolerse que no es el discurso de la victimización, ni mucho menos de la resignación, sino una práctica de la comunidad generada en la experiencia crítica, end quote. In Dolerse, Rivera Garza offers a concrete example of what a disappropriative, necro-writing communitarian response might look like with a piece of documentary poetry that incorporates all the ideas I have discussed here. So I was going to show a video of this poem being read during the protests in El Zócalo in 2011, but apparently I can't show it because of copyright issues. So I'm wondering if there's anybody that could read the poem. You all have a copy of it. It's El Reclamante. Do we have a volunteer? Someone give me a break.
I can do it.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Or should we like popcorn? Like, you know, there's no popcorn. Like one person reads it, one stanza.
That would be great. I would love that, actually.
Any other volunteers to do that?
Sure.
I'll popcorn. You'll do it. with me?
Okay.
Alberto, también. You'll do that too. Okay, great.
Great.
Okay. La reclamante. Discúlpeme, señor presidente, pero no le doy la mano. Usted no es mi amigo. Yo no le puedo dar la bienvenida. Usted no es bienvenido. Nadie lo es.
Luz María Dávila, Díaz de Salvarcar, madre de Marcos y José Luis Piña Dávila, de 19 y 17 años de edad.
No es justo, mis muchachitos estaban en una fiesta y los mataron.
Masacre del sábado 30 de enero en Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, 15 muertos.
Porque aquí en Ciudad Juárez, póngase en mi lugar.
Villas de Salvarcar, mi espalda, mi fulminea paradoja.
Hace 2 años que se están cometiendo asesinatos, se están cometiendo muchas cosas. Cometer es un verbo fúlgido, un radioso vértigo, un letárgico tremor.
Se están cometiendo muchas cosas y nadie hace algo. Y yo solo quiero que se haga justicia, y no solo para mis 2 niños.
Los difuntos remordidos, los fulminosos masacrados, los fúlgidos perdidos.
Sino para todos, justicia.
Encarar, espetar, reclamar, echar en cara, demandar, exigir, requerir, reivindicar.
No me diga, por supuesto, haga algo. Si a usted le hubieran matado a un hijo, usted, debajo de las piedras, buscaba al asesino.
Debajo de las piedras, debajo de piedras, debajo de...
Porque como yo no tengo los recursos.
Limosnas para las aves, mis huesos, mi carne, de tu carne, mi carne.
Póngase en mi lugar, póngase en mis zapatos, mis uñas, mi calosfrío estelar. No los puedo buscar porque no tengo recursos. Tengo muertos a mis 2 hijos.
Viador, entierro a cielo abierto, que significa literalmente dar limosnas a los pájaros.
Tengo mi espalda, mi lágrima, mi martillo. No tengo justicia. Póngase en su sitio, villas de Salvarcar, ahí donde mataron a mis 2 hijos.
Usted no es mi amigo. Esa es la mano que no le doy. Póngase, señor presidente, en su lugar. Le doy mi espalda.
Mi sed le doy, mi calos frío ignoto, mi remordida ternura, mis fulgidas aves, mis muertos.
Y la mujer bajita, de suéter azul, salió del salón, limpiándose las lágrimas.
Muchísimas gracias. Súper lindo. And you can still see not only this video, but you can see the video of Luz Maria Davila confronting Felipe Calderón. It's still on the web if you want to watch it. And that's where many of these words came from, that confrontation. So this documentary poem, a documentary poem being built from archives, they can be historical, they can be archives from labor unions, whatever. Documentary poems are built from found archival materials, and this is one. The reclamante weaves the words of Luz Maria Davila, the mother of 2 boys killed in a massacre in Ciudad Juarez, with found journalistic language, fragments of Ramón López Velarde's iconic patriotic poem La Suave Patria from 1921, and Rivera Garza's own poetic language to create the powerful image of a madre doliente who confronts then-President Felipe Calderón, armed with nothing but her own suffering and her seeming lack of agency, as when she says, no los puedo buscar porque no tengo recursos, tengo muertos a mis 2 hijos. In the context of Rivera Garza's idea of tragic agency, the suffering and powerlessness of this grieving mother becomes her agency, as she demands empathy and action from those in power, saying, póngase en mi lugar, yo solo quiero que se haga justicia, y no solo para mis 2 niños, justicia. The póngase en mi lugar is a call to empathy, to a collectivity based in shared vulnerability and community. The inability of the president to really put himself in the shoes of the woman who confronts him signals the failure of liberal democracy when confronted with the responsibility of responding empathically to the suffering of its people. When I shared this text with my students, one well-trained student immediately questioned the appropriation of Davila's word by Rivera Garza. In answer, I shared with the class the text that Rivera Garza wrote after her personal visit with Maria Luz Davila, in which she travels through perilous territory in Juarez, listens, empathizes, and grieves with Davila, not as a writer or a reporter, but as a mother. The ethical commitment demonstrated by the poet here is palpable. In the bibliography that Rivera Garza offers for the poem, she cites not only Luz Maria Davila and López Velarde, but also the words of the journalist Sandra Rodriguez Nieto, who initially reported the story. Indeed, both the sourcing and the outlet for this poem can be conceived as communitarian, in that Rivera Garza not only includes the riveting words spoke by Davila, but the poem eventually finds its way to the Zócalo in Mexico City during La Marcha Nacional by the Movimiento por la Paz con Justicia y Dignidad in April of 2011. In this way, La Reclamante represents a striking example of Rivera Garza's disappropriation in art, in which she frames as a radical leveling of hierarchies in the production of texts that acknowledge the unpayable debt, and in which the text achieves its ultimate goal, which is, quote, to return all writing to its plural origin, to return the writing to the pueblo, from where it came. So, okay. Nope, not allowed to show that. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two more poets now. Hopefully I have time with you all to do this. I'm going to talk about Sara Uribe and Balam Rodrigo. The recent poetic projects of Mexican poets Sara Uribe and Balam Rodrigo share Rivera Garza's ethical impulse to foreground the narratives of individuals whose experience and language has been overlooked and deauthorized by the nationalist and narco-narratives prevalent in both the U.S. and Mexico. I choose to bring these writers to San Jose State because I felt their work would resonate with the concerns that our students already had, and also provide an opportunity for learning and growth as we examine together the context and creation of these remarkable texts. Uribe's Antígona González describes a sister's search for the body of her brother, lost to Mexico's ongoing violence, while Rodrigo's Libro centroamericano de los muertos evokes the voices of Central American migrants who braved the treacherous southern Mexican border in their bid to make it north and lost their bet. These two Mexican poets, who themselves speak from the peripheries of establishment Mexican literary culture, exemplify some of the most sophisticated and subtle efforts to represent the experience of the dispossessed and silenced in Mexico's turbulent landscape. A landscape that we cannot forget has been created in part by policies and economic pressures originating in the U.S. For both Uribe and Rodrigo, the ethical implications of representing the voices of the victims of this violence weigh heavily upon them as artists and as individuals. They are very aware of the dangers of appropriation, of speaking for and speaking as those marginalized by our violent neoliberal reality. And they approach their material with respect and caution, but also with the passionate conviction they have a role to play in bringing these voices into public discourse. In this, they share Rivera Garza's ethics of disappropriative strategies, and their texts clearly embody the kind of necro writing that asks us to question what we think we know and to join in the work of grieving and in demanding visibility and justice for those lost to violence in Mexico. So, a little more context before I talk about them. In today's Mexico, there is a clear overlap between the disappearance of Mexican citizens in the ongoing drug wars and the death and disappearance of unknown thousands of Central American migrants. Estimates range between 70,000 to 500,000 as they pass through the region. We'll really never know those numbers. The active silencing and distorting of this reality by a Mexican regime that has been both inept and shockingly complicit in the violence ensures that their stories have not been told. As the poorest and most vulnerable are disproportionately affected, silence and misinformation reign over a landscape saturated with fear. As the death of dozens of activists and reporters attest, the act of speaking of these atrocities is a perilous one, undertaken by individuals who must weigh the risks of speaking truth to power in its most naked and brutal form, the necropolitical power wielded by both the state and the cartels. Rivera Garza, Rodrigo, and Uribe confront these issues under the most extreme circumstances and offer solutions both aesthetic and ethical in ways that connect directly to urgent questions about representation, authority, and visibility. Sara Uribe, Instructions for Counting the Dead. Already an accomplished poet in Mexico, Sara Uribe burst into international literary awareness in 2016 with the translation into English and the publication of her book of poems, Antígona González, translated by J.D. Plucker, a founding member of the innovative Antígona translation group. Uribe's residence in the northern Mexican state of Tamaulipas, which is considered the most violent state in Mexico, compelled her to finally overcome her admitted reticence to handle the delicate and difficult topic of Mexico's desaparecidos and agreed to undertake the composition of the work, originally commissioned by Sandra Muñez for public performance. Uribe could have also begun her text by saying, "Me gustaría que este libro no existiera." She was afraid of handling these stories, afraid of doing further violence to people who had already suffered so much. The final tipping point in her decision was the discovery of the bodies of those 72 murdered Central American and South American migrants in San Fernando, not far from her home, and the refusal of the authorities to acknowledge the existence of those murdered during a public event she was attending. She said, "That morning, the uninterrupted normalcy proclaimed by the government itself was a huge signpost that said, 'Nothing has happened here.'" End quote. In shaking up this project, Uribe also contests the prevalent idea that the victim must be somehow implicated in the violence perpetrated against them. In Mexico, it's por algo será, no? O hizo algo, right? So that there's some connection to the cartels of the violence, and so the victim is somehow disposable or it's not a big deal. This counters the idea that the victims of violence must have been somehow guilty of something, criminal others who don't deserve to be acknowledged or mourned. Composed as an extended documentary poem, Antígona González traces the agonized and valiant search of a modern Antígona for her lost brother, Tadeo, one of the countless desaparecidos in the narco-war in Tamaulipas, through the careful weaving together of found language. You may be familiar with the symbol of Sophocles' Antigone as an example of resistance against tyrannical and inhumane policies. You may also have read Judith Butler's book, Antigone's Claim, Kinship Between Life and Death, which queries the fraught relationship between kinship ties and the state. However, and as Tamara Williams has explained, Uribe's Antigone operates in the absence of her traditional antagonist of the monolithic state and its unjust laws, as her Mexico shows itself as a corrupted shell of a government, unable and unwilling to truly confront the violence that ravages its citizens. Here, the enemy is much more difficult to pin down, as it takes the form of violent narcos, yes, but also that of a cynical state and a terrified populace that would sometimes rather deny their own kin than confront the terror implied by their disappearance and the threat of reprisals. In the construction of her book-length documentary poem, built on disappropriative strategies, Uribe manages a self-aware engagement with the language of others at their most vulnerable, including the real words of family members of the disappeared, the ephemeral language of the nota roja, which is like the crime sheets in Mexico. If you've seen them, there's shocking photos and like very kind of succinct journalistic language about the crime, and the incorporation of other Latin American literary texts depicting Antigone's defiance and search for justice. Uribe composes her text with a striking awareness of her own authority and responsibility in the heavy task she's been asked to perform, often in implicit conversation with contemporary theories dealing with authority, empathy, and representation. Cristina Rivera Garza, who was instrumental in the first publication of Uribe's text, that's important, Sur Plus, describes the work as, quote, "As urgent as it is delicate, Antígona González summons the dead and brings them to our tables. For the day we cease sharing memory and language with them, we ourselves will become lost, vanish sign, oblivion." This is the embodiment and evocation of the condolerse, the mourning together, that Rivera Garza urges us to take up. Uribe describes her use of verbatim testimony by family members in her work as a way of creating, quote, "un espacio de encuentro con la realidad de la guerra en nuestro país. Mi deseo era que, tras toparse cara a cara con el dolor y con la ausencia, el lector pudiera pensar y repensar, no como para hallar una solución, pero sí como una manera de no permanecer ajeno, de no distanciarnos del dolor de los otros, sino, por el contrario, de hacerlo nuestro, de participar en el duelo colectivo tan necesario entonces como ahora." So she is aware of the limitations of literature, and she doesn't pretend that her book can fix the crisis in Mexico, but she proposes a smaller goal, one that returns humanity not only to the disappeared, but also to those that survive and bear witness to the lost. Uribe's text authorizes us to recognize our common humanity and to take up the task of mourning in defiance of the forces of repression, silencing, and impunity prevalent in both the U.S. and Mexico. As in Sophocles' original play, Antígona represents those family members who refuse to be silenced by the law and the unlawful law. Quote, I tell them without a body there's no refuge, no peace possible for my heart, for anyone. End quote. The agency of these disappeared bodies persists in their connections with the living, in what Rivera Garza calls the tragic agency that invites us to think about agency in circumstances that normally look like powerlessness, the agency of an inert and even lost body that calls us to action. Resonating with Judith Butler's discussion of autonomy and interdependence, in Uribe's poetry, the need to recover the body is intimately linked to the verification of one's own existence. Quote, the task of recognizing the body, the one we touch to know we are real, the one that sheltered us with an embrace. End quote. There is no I without the other. The task of mourning involves not only acknowledging the violence done to the beloved and to the community, but also recovering the traces that make the individual real for us. Uribe never makes the dead speak. Instead, she allows the words that surrounded the disappeared to make the shape of the absence that recalls the humanity of the disappeared. In taking up the task of narrating the loss of these bodies and the unsettled mourning that results from the uncertain loss, Sara Uribe reaches for her own shared humanity and for ours, as she calls upon us to remember someone we never knew. Who was the dead body? He liked to dance polkas, redojas, and even guapangos. He was a really happy person. They wrote a corrido just for him. We would still dance. He was always a good father. We had 5 children. We have 15 grandkids and 4 great-grandkids. The poemario ends with an entreaty. Will you join me in taking up the body? Uribe's poem shows us a way of taking up the body together, of acknowledging the existence of those who have passed through life and death seemingly without leaving a lasting mark, but whose very vulnerability calls to our own and demands our attention and care. So this is my aside where I talk about Sara's visit to San Jose State. And so every time I bring a writer, I keep trying to do more. So when Sara came, we did a bilingual reading of Antígona González with the students. So students took the part, just as you all did today, which was lovely. Sara also did an amazing writing workshop with the students in Spanish with the Chicanx Latinx Student Success Center. She visited with our classes and talked to students who had been reading her work all semester. We did an interview with the podcast, Hablemos Escritoras, if you're interested in women writers from Latin America or Spanish-speaking women writers. This is an amazing podcast. There's now hundreds of interviews and articles on women writers. It's really phenomenal. And then we also visited UC Berkeley and did a reading. So I try to do a lot whenever they come. And here we are. I just wanted to share some photos because it's heavy material. It's hard and tragic and sad, but our events are really joyful because it is this coming together of community. And the students, I remember at her reading, one of the students actually asked her, weren't you afraid to write this? And she said, yeah, I had threats. And the student who asked her said, yeah, I know. I'm from that area. I know what you're talking about. And so the opportunity of students to interact with her was very powerful in that way, and also very joyful. So that was Sara's visit. And now I'll finish with Balam. In a way, Balam Rodrigo's poemario takes up where Sara Uribe's leaves off, answering her call, will you join me in taking up the body? In his Libro centroamericano de los muertos from 2018, the bodies of the disappeared are located but severed from their identities. The bodies found beneath the rails of the train known as La Bestia, or murdered by narcos or maras or police or by their lovers, exist as the formless matter that Uribe had identified as the hope and terror of family members who search. In this book, Rodrigo takes the audacious leap of giving voice to this matter. Unlike Spoon River Anthology or Pedro Páramo, or the voices in Libro Centroamericano de los Muertos are untethered from the gravestones that anchor the dead to a place and a community. They are lost and cut away from their natural links. But Balam Rodrigo hears them as he says, "A flock of migratory voices whispers in my ear." He stops to consider the bodies and to imagine identities and stories that restore the links of humanity that makes these bodies our responsibility again, as Rivera Garza has posited. Balam Rodrigo is one of the most celebrated living Mexican poets and a member of the National Sistema de Creadores Nacionales. Sorry. He is the winner of numerous literary prizes, including the Premio Bellas Artes de Poesía Aguascalientes of 2018, which he won for Libro Centroamericano de los Muertos. His trajectory is even more impressive because his origins are humble. His childhood was spent helping his father sell his specially made display cases in Chiapas and clandestinely across the border to the south in Guatemala. His publications Marabunta and Libro Centroamericano de los Muertos come in part from these profoundly personal experiences. Balam carries his empathy for Central American migrants in his DNA. As a child, Balam lived with a multitude of Central Americans who passed through his family's home in Chiapas on the southern border of Mexico on their way north. In his poetry, his uncertainty about the fate of most of these more than 300 people who left their mark on his childhood melds with his outrage about the treatment of Central American migrants crossing Mexico, who are subject to the depredation of narcos, gang members, corrupt police, and immigration officials in their quest for safety and security in the U.S. Libro Centroamericano de los Muertos is a powerful revelation of voices never meant to be heard by the powers that be. Rodrigo works to link the atrocities experienced by Central American migrants, mostly from Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador, on the southern border of Mexico, with Bartolomé de las Casas' colonial-era protests against Spanish brutality, and with the traditional cosmology and language of the indigenous people of Central America in a disappropriative palimpsest poem. His intercalation of migrant testimony from specific Central American countries returns specificity to individuals who seek to cross national borders without the language and the papers that would grant legitimacy to their movement, and challenges the authority of the governments who dehumanize and deauthorize those who seek sanctuary. Many of the poems in Libro Centroamericano de los Muertos have specific latitude-longitude locations as titles. These mark the places where bodies have been found. Rodrigo's recovery of these bodies is sometimes based on a small fragment, like the young boy who wore a soccer jersey with the number 11 of his idol to his appointment with death on La Bestia. This is my student Carlos Escobar's translation. Just like El Mágico, I will carry an 11 tattooed on my back, maybe because the number of bags they used to pick up all the pieces of my body, maybe because I was wearing the Selectus jersey with the same number, or maybe because death carries engraved on her belly the infinite 11 of the train tracks. Likewise, the aspiring cantante de corridos in Rodrigo's poem 18 degrees, 7 minutes, 34.1 seconds north, 94 degrees, 29 minutes, 1.4 seconds west, explains his decapitation by gangs as the loss of his voice and the loss of his song. And this is my student Jason Bush's translation. The singer that I am, who I was, now bites silence, handfuls of tears, black earth, blood dried by the stars. This voice had been deauthorized in the most brutal way conceivable, and Balam imagined him twice lost in death and disappearance. Throughout Libro Centroamericano, Rodrigo evokes the voices of the dispossessed, those repressed, tortured, and neglected in their home country, whose flight towards safety and opportunity is shortcut in Mexico, for them, a, quote, mass grave where the body of the world rots. In this collective body, we see the destruction of more than individuals. We see the careless liquidation of a sacred understanding of a people as a culture and a vision of the world, often an indigenous one. Many of the poems contrast the points of origin of the migrants with the hostile coordinates of Mexico where they meet their anonymous death. In Libro Centroamericano de los Muertos, the tragic agency of these migrants calls out to us and demands recognition of the humanity of the most vulnerable and disregarded of our fellow humans. So, can't even see him. He's on the train there. It's very dark.
Okay.
To frame Balam's visit to San Jose State, and I'm almost done. You guys are so wonderful and patient. I want to share the vision as I picked him up at SFO. He's very small and strong, and he carries a massive backpack. And the backpack is full of books, because I couldn't get the books. They were like sold out. So he brought the books to sell. But later, when we went to the ACE charter school and he met students who had made it, Central American students who had made it across Mexico and were starting their lives here, and he spoke with them and he read his poems with the students who worked on translations with us for his poems. He said he felt as though he was bringing those people that failed to make it, that the books were their voices and that he was crossing the border with them, for them, which was a very powerful image, I think. And then in terms of our translation project, I just wanted to say, I assigned this translation project and everyone was supposed to do 3 texts and they were going to have this big public event at Teatro down in San Jose. And then I realized that I had done something really thoughtless that marked my own acknowledged privilege as a native English speaker. The majority of my students were native Spanish speakers, and the challenge of translating into English was daunting, right? So I reconsidered and we reshaped the class so we could work together on revisions. 2 students came from Guatemala and El Salvador as children, so they had all the cultural context and linguistic specificity. Then we had native English speakers who were able to polish the text in English. We read out loud, we offered suggestions, and the poems that resulted were just spectacular. It's a collaborative translation, very powerful. And they read their versions with the Balam in a packed house at the Hammer Theater. So this is like, this was, the last event I did before the pandemic, and also the most powerful and emblematic of what I hope to do going forward. So I know I've taken up a lot of time, more than my share. So sorry about that. I had a video I wanted to show of a student, but we could just do, we could do questions instead. So.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much, Sheila.
Sure.
This was incredible. You are getting all sorts of flurry of congratulations from some of your students. I think it's Cel and Balam, also Brian Chavez, and Griego. We do have a question from I want to start with a question from the YouTube chat from one of my colleagues, from Hector Hoyos.
Yeah.
He says, kudos for integrating the teaching and research in this incredible fashion, dear Sheila. A question is, what permits you to have students, which goes to precisely the last point, to have students with different levels of competency in Spanish to work together in this kind of setting? Absolutely.
I mean, I think maybe I answered that question. The thing is, we try to integrate across the curriculum. So a poet is coming to San Jose State. Obviously, my graduate students are working on this very intense semester-long collaborative translation project, and they're going to participate in a public event. I also did have several undergraduates who, instead of doing a final project in my Latin American literature class, chose to participate in that translation and in that event, and they were wonderful. So there's different levels. Obviously, for more entry-level Spanish or people who aren't quite ready to do that kind of work, we'll share a smaller piece of the poem. The wonderful thing about Antígona González is that it's in a beautiful bilingual edition. Balam, if you're listening, I'm super excited. He's going to have 2 books coming out in bilingual editions. Libro Centroamericano has been translated by Dan Balam, which is going to be great. And I know Marabunta just came out, which is another related book. And so that's very exciting. We can work, I think, sometimes with students whose Spanish isn't quite up to reading this kind of complex stuff, having those facing texts. I remember when I was learning Spanish, having a bilingual text was so helpful because you didn't have to go to the dictionary. So we find different ways to invite people in, I think. But that's a great question. Yeah.
So a question from here,
Thank you so much for presenting your work. It was truly an honor to hear you speak. You mentioned Judith Butler, and I also think of her piece, Violence, Mourning, and Politics, and you spoke of a body. What is a body? I thought of Hortense Spillers and like flesh versus body when thinking about the the Black female body.
Okay.
And so my interaction with grief and mourning has been through feminist theory, and even just reading this piece that is like from a mother talking about her two sons.
Right.
I can't help but mostly associate the act of mourning to be gendered, and I wanted to ask how your interaction with that concept was as you were doing your research.
Wow, that's really interesting. I mean, you know, as I was doing this talk, I was thinking about my colleague Amanda Peterson, who works with feminisms in Mexico and is really plugged in to all of the movements, the Ni Uno Menos and the Primer Caso, you know, M8 and all those things, right, that are very female gendered. I think that I see what you're saying about that mourning, but I also see that it is really a human characteristic. I mean, I'm thinking about Butler when she talks about that early interdependence that we kind of forget about, and that is a relationship between the child and the mother, but also the relationship between the child and other caregivers. Because we are so completely vulnerable when we're babies. I mean, that's what Butler's saying. And that to become an adult, we have to kind of forget that vulnerability to become this autonomous, bounded being that goes out in the world and has hard edges, you know. So there is something about mothering, but it doesn't have to be a biological mothering, maybe. And also, I think there's space for other kinds of care in the process of mourning. So it's such an interesting question. I think it's worth diving into. But I wouldn't say it's only or specifically, you know, female gender.
We have probably to wrap up the segment that is being live streamed, but I do want to mention Amanda Peterson actually sends greetings, saludos, and she says such an impactful example of teaching, research, and activism.
Yeah.
So I think she summarizes quite well what I think all of us in the room are feeling right now.
Right.
I do invite you all to come and join us for next Friday seminar series, which will be by Dr. Carolina Curvale. She's going to come with us from Ecuador during the pandemic, new government and polarization. Thank you so much, Sheila, and those of you who are here in the room will continue a little bit the conversation informally. Thank you so much.
Everybody.